Well, over a decade ago, the United Nations established the International Criminal Court. Now, the court investigates and tries cases of war crimes and crimes against humanity. The ICC has recently come under scrutiny because it appears to be primarily focusing only on African leaders, such as newly elected Kenya's Uhuru Kenyatta and Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir. Africa 54's Paul Ndiho has our report.
All eyes are on Fatou Bensouda, a Gambian national who was elected in December 2011 to serve as the first African chief prosecutor for the International Criminal Court. Initially, Bensouda was overwhelmingly supported by African countries, but now critics say that the court is biased because the majority of its investigations and indictments are seemingly centered on Africa and its leaders. But the ICC's chief prosecutor is not taking the charges lightly.
I have consistently said that this is not the case. On the contrary, we have seen that Africa is actually coming towards and engaging the ICC like no other region is doing. And for all the cases that you now have before the International Criminal Court, in fact, 90% of them were at the initiative of the African states themselves requesting the International Criminal Court's intervention.
Africans are beginning to pay more attention to the ICC's interest in their continent. According to David Bosco, an assistant professor at American University School of International Service in Washington, D.C. Bosco authored the book International Criminal Court, Rough Justice, and he recently penned an article in the Washington Post questioning why the ICC is picking only on Africa.
Well, it is very striking that we're now more than a decade into the ICC's operations, and every investigation and every person indicted has been African.
The election of Uhuru Kenyatta as Kenya's president and William Ruto as vice president in March is yet another test for the International Criminal Court. Many Kenyans are questioning the validity of Uhuru's case at The Hague, and his lawyers want the charges of crimes against humanity against him dropped after the ICC's case against former Kenyan ambassador Francis Muthaura collapsed after a key witness was discredited. But prosecutors at the court say Mr. Kenyatta has a case to answer for allegedly orchestrating violence after the 2007 election.
I have always said that electing them into these positions is not going to make the case go away. The case has always been and will always be based on the evidence that we present before the judges.
Like many critics, Bosco notes that the court's decision to put Mr. Kenyatta on trial is likely to have far-reaching consequences in Kenya.
It's going to be very interesting to watch now with Kenya, where an indicted individual, two individuals, the president and the vice president, have been indicted, and they have now been elected. There's the question of what's going to happen with their trials.
Some analysts say President-elect could become the first head of state to be actively defending charges at the ICC. Despite all the condemnation, the ICC has managed to secure one conviction. Last July, the court jailed Congolese warlord Thomas Lubanga Diallo for 14 years for recruiting child soldiers under the age of 15 and for forcing them to fight in a war in the Democratic Republic of Congo in 2000 and 2003. Diallo's co-accused Bosco Ntaganda, also known as the Terminator, evaded arrest on war crimes charges for more than 7 years before unexpectedly giving himself up to diplomats at the U.S. Embassy in Rwanda last month. Ntaganda is accused of murder, rape and other crimes over a 15-year period of fighting in the Rwandan-backed rebellions in eastern DRC. Ntaganda's appearance in the court is a much-needed success story for the ICC, with many of the court suspects, including Ugandan warlord Joseph Kony and Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir, still at large. And beyond its reach, Ntaganda's arrival is especially welcome to the prosecutors and the activists. Paul Ndiho, VOA News.
Thanks to Paul for that. Now joining us is Charles Cherner Jalloh, Assistant Professor of Law at the University of Pittsburgh, and he joins us via Skype, and we would like to welcome you to Africa 54, Professor Jalloh.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Well, let's start off with some of the points mentioned in the package we just ran, and this is about the newly elected president and vice president now of Kenya, and they're supposed to be appearing at The Hague May and July. Do you think this will proceed?
Yes, as you heard from that piece, the prosecutor's position is that the process before the court will continue, even though, of course, now we have an unusual situation where a sitting president, a newly elected president, as well as his deputy, the vice president, are both individuals who have been indicted by the International Criminal Court. I think the point to emphasize is that what is happening in Kenya at the domestic political level is distinctive from what is happening at the International Criminal Court, which is a case that Mr. Kenyatta has to answer, as well as his deputy. They are alleged to have committed international crimes.
Right.
And it is, of course, the responsibility of the prosecutor to prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt before the independent and impartial tribunal.
Now,
whether the prosecutor would be able to do that, it's a question that we would only be able to answer after we hear the evidence, after the judges hear the evidence against Mr. Kenyatta and Mr. Ruto as well. Now,
Mr. Jalloh, moving on, one issue you're very, very familiar with, and is this accusation against the ICC that it has been targeting African countries. Of all the 122 members of that body, 8 have been targeted, and all 8 are African. Do you agree with that?
Well, I actually have written quite a bit, as you pointed out, on the relationship between Africa and the International Criminal Court. That interest started way back in 2008 when the prosecutor of the court at the time, Mr. Luis Moreno Ocampo, announced an indictment would be sought against the Sudanese president, Omar al-Bashir. I have a number of responses to the argument. I think, firstly, it is fair to say that the cases before the court have come to the court because African states have shown an interest in trying to use the court for their own purposes. The first set of referrals by states parties to the Rome Statute were by African states, led off by Uganda, followed by Democratic Republic of Congo, and then the Central African Republic.
So in short,
Kenya
Mr. Jalloh,
had indicated an interest in actually bringing its case to the ICC
and
reached an agreement with the prosecutor that they would be involved in the situation if Kenya would not proceed to set up a special tribunal for Kenya, which, as you know, did not happen because the Kenyan parliament rejected that proposal at least on 2 occasions.
Now,
so I think the first response is that African states have actually to be very careful because they are the ones that are trying to use the court, at the same time making an argument that the court is targeting them. The second response is very brief, and that is a political argument. I think there are aspects of the involvement of the court in Africa that one might look at and find to be a little bit troublesome. In particular, perhaps, the involvement of the court in the Libya situation, which did not go to the court by way of a referral by the country itself, Libya not being a party to the statute, but by fiat of the request of the Security Council, which has the power to do so under its responsibility to maintain international peace and security.
Okay, well, just very briefly, do you think anything will change under the new prosecutor who is from Gambia? Very briefly.
Well, the new prosecutor has a tremendously difficult job, but I think she has taken the view that nothing will change as such, that she's there to speak on behalf of African victims of international crimes. And I want to emphasize that I think there shouldn't be too much expectations placed on the prosecutor because she's also a prosecutor for the entire 122 states parties to the ICC, not just the 34 African countries that are parties to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court.
Well, Mr. Jalloh, thank you so much for a great perspective. Charles Cherner Jalloh is the Assistant Professor of Law at the University of Pittsburgh, and he joined us via Skype from Pittsburgh.